Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's ALIGN-CCUS webinar on implementing CCUS in society. Thank you very much for joining the webinar and contributing to the webinar under these difficult and unusual circumstances. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. Next slide, please. You have joined the webinar using your computer speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. Next slide, please. You have the opportunity to submit questions to today's presenters. You can do so by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the webinar. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Next slide, please. In two presentations today, the presenter will pose a poll question to the audience. You can answer the question using the online system. You just click on the answer of your choice and press submit. You will have a few seconds to answer each question. Today's webinar will be recorded and you can find the recording on our website, ALIGN-CCUS.eu. Next slide, please. So good afternoon all. My name is Emma ten Mors and I work as a senior researcher at the Social, Economic and Organizational Psychology Department at Leiden University in the Netherlands. And in the ALIGN-CCUS project, I lead the social science work within ALIGN. And today I will be the chair of this webinar. About ALIGN-CCUS, ALIGN-CCUS stands for Accelerating Low Carbon Industrial Growth through CCUS. ALIGN-CCUS is a project within ACT, and ACT meaning Accelerating CCUS Technologies. The current ACT projects are funded by the participating countries and the EU. The countries involved in ALIGN-CCUS are Romania, Germany, United Kingdom, Norway, and the Netherlands. And this is the 6th webinar for ALIGN-CCUS. All webinars have been recorded, so you can watch them online through our website, ALIGN-CCUS.eu. Also, other information about the project can be found here. This webinar is focused on the work on implementing CCUS in society in ALIGN-CCUS. And today we have the following agenda. First, I will give a short introduction of the topic. Then Kevin Broecks will present research findings on public perception of industrial CCS in the UK and the Netherlands. After this, Diana Cismaru will talk about stakeholder perceptions in Romania. The last presentation is from Christine Boomsma, and it will be about community engagement and compensation strategies. Next slide, please. Regarding my introduction, what I'd like to do today is give a brief introduction on the social science work conducted in the ALIGN project. So what it is that we do and why this is relevant. But before I do so, I think it's important to first give some background information on the topic of CCUS. So what is it and why is it relevant? And the ALIGN-CCUS project itself. Next slide, please. Climate change is one of the greatest challenges of our time. Scientists agree that climate change is happening and that it's caused by humans, that is by ever-increasing CO2 emitted by human activities. The good news here is that international and national climate agreements are being made to reduce worldwide CO2 emissions and prevent further climate change. Take, for example, the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. To reduce CO2 emissions substantially, a lot will have to change in our societies. For example, the way we produce energy and the type of fuels we use for transport. To reach climate goals, also the implementation of innovative technology will be required. Next slide, please. As I just mentioned, the climate agreements require changes and innovations in many areas. We need to implement many different technologies to reach our goals. However, one can design a truly great technology, one that many engineers and policymakers feel is effective and also cost-effective. But if society at large doesn't approve of it, this will hinder the implementation of the technology. It could lead to delays in projects and implementation, and even to cancellation of projects. And of course, this would be very problematic, as it could mean that climate change mitigation goals cannot be met. How society at large perceives a new technology is key for its implementation. In the ALIGN-CCUS project, we focus on a specific climate change mitigation technology that can be applied in industry, called CCUS. Next slide, please. CCUS stands for carbon dioxide capture, transport, utilization, and storage. In an industrial context, it involves capturing the CO2 emitted by industrial plants, the transport of the CO2, for example via ships or pipelines, and the permanent storage of the CO2 deep under the seabed, for example in depleted oil or gas fields. Further, a small part of the captured CO2 can be reused, for example by greenhouses or to produce fuels. The ALIGN-CCUS project unites science and industry in a shared goal of transforming 6 European regions into low-carbon centers by 2025. The project is a large European research project with more than 30 research institutes and industrial partners from 5 countries involved. The ALIGN-CCUS project has 6 specific interlinking areas of research, focusing on CO2 capture, CO2 storage, CO2 transport, CO2 reuse, industrial clusters, and last but not least, on societal perception of industrial CCUS. It is this social science work that the current webinar focuses on. Next slide, please. The social science team in ALIGN consists of 20 researchers from the 6 institutes depicted on the slide, with partners from the Netherlands, UK, Germany, Romania, and Norway represented. Next slide, please. Social science research is key for the successful and timely implementation of CCUS and other climate change mitigation technologies. Social science research can help in creating a so-called social license to operate. For example, by providing insights in narratives, arguments, and visuals used in the media, by identifying relevant stakeholders and their perceptions, and by identifying determinants of public opinion. And all of this will help in making site selection decisions and in developing effective public engagement strategies. Next slide, please. The ALIGN-CCUS social science research aims to contribute to science, practice, and policy by means of conducting high-quality basic and applied research. The ALIGN-CCUS social science research concentrates on 3 themes. The first theme being public and stakeholder perception of industrial CCUS. So what do public and stakeholders think of industrial CCUS and why? The second theme we are focusing on is community engagement and compensation. So what are success factors and pitfalls when implementing a CCUS project near a local community? How to best and respectfully involve and engage with communities and local stakeholders? And finally, the third theme we focus on in our research is communication and discourse. So how is CCUS currently communicated in the media? What are people's information needs and how to best communicate about the topic? And in today's webinar, we'll have presentations on the first 2 themes. And finally, in terms of the methodology used, we use both qualitative and quantitative research methods. That is, we conduct desk research, interviews, focus groups, survey research, experiments, and also media analysis. Next slide, please. So we're currently in our final year of the ALIGN-CCUS project. The project ends in August this year. In case you'd like to learn more about the project and its results, please visit the ALIGN-CCUS website, where you can subscribe for the ALIGN-CCUS newsletter and where you can find, among other things, the recordings of previous webinars, output such as reports, articles, blogs, presentations, and really recommended a really nice ALIGN wiki. I now would like to introduce the next speaker, Kevin Broecks from TNO. He will tell us more about how the general public in the Netherlands and the UK perceives industrial CCUS.
Well, thank you for introducing me, Emma. My name is Kevin Broecks. I'm a scientist at the Energy Transition Studies group of TNO. And in my research, I focus on how citizens can be involved in decarbonization of industry. And in today's talk, I will be telling you about a study we did into the public perception of industrial CCS. In my talk, I will show the results of a large-scale informed polling survey we did recently among the public in the Netherlands and the UK. In such an informed survey, respondents receive information about a topic before indicating their opinion on this topic. Next slide, please. First, I want to talk about why measuring informed opinions is valuable. You do this because people's opinions tend to change over time, like the graph displayed here. If you give people no information before asking about a topic, their given opinion may depend strongly on their mood, the weather, or the time of day. These opinions are more likely to change over time and be easily influenced by others. Opinions gathered after information is given are more stable, more predictive of future results, and less easily changed. Next slide, please. So why have we done this particular study? Our study differs from previous informed polls for CCS in two ways. First, the technological configuration we look at differs. Previous studies tended to focus on CCS at power plants with onshore storage. Our study looks specifically at the combination of CCS at industries, such as steel, cement, or fertilizer, with offshore storage of CO2. Second, these previous studies paid little attention to the role of place. They ignored the influences of people's proximity to industry and their attitude towards these industries. Next slide, please. Next, I would like to tell you how the study was done. We used an online survey that was filled out by 2,000 respondents from a panel. For the survey, we used 4 respondent groups, 2 groups from the UK and 2 groups from the Netherlands. For each country, we had 1 representative sample of the general population and 1 sample of people that live close to industry. In the survey, respondents read several blocks of information about industrial CCS. First, we explained what CO2 is and how it causes climate change. Then we elucidated how industrial CCS works, including the capture, transport, and storage steps. Finally, we explained how CCS will be implemented and what the outcomes of implementation are. We included 9 outcomes about climate change, economics, and safety. Respondents answered questions about CCS and about themselves in between these blocks of information. To construct the survey, we did a desktop study into other informed polls about CCS to identify questions and materials we could reuse. We then subjected our information and survey to a review by 14 CCS experts and 8 lay people. Next slide, please. In the remainder of this talk, I would like to show the following 4 highlights of our results. About industrial CCS, citizens have moderate awareness but low knowledge. They tend to have neutral to slightly positive opinions. They tend to be positive about its climate and economic outcomes, but negative about its safety outcomes. And finally, citizens' opinions are strongly affected by their attitude toward industry. Next slide, please. In this graph, we've displayed citizens' awareness and knowledge of CCS, industrial CCS, and plans of the government for industrial CCS. On the vertical axis, we displayed the percentage of respondents that had heard about the topic before. On the horizontal axis, we displayed how much knowledge respondents thought they had about the topic on a scale from 1, nothing at all, to 7, a lot. The graph shows that most people have heard about CCS, but think they have no or very little knowledge about it. The graph also clearly shows that awareness and knowledge are higher in the Netherlands, shown in orange, than in the UK, shown in blue. Finally, you can see that people know a bit more about CCS in general than about CCS in industry, or plans of the government for CCS in industry. Next slide, please. In this graph, we displayed how positive or negative respondents were about industrial CCS after reading information. Their opinion was measured on a scale from 1, very negative, to 7, very positive. On the vertical axis, we displayed the percentage of respondents with a particular opinion. The graph demonstrates that more people are positive than negative, although a substantial group is negative, about 15%. you can also see that people in the UK are more positive on average than people in the Netherlands. This difference is caused primarily by the larger group of very positive people in the UK, shown on the very right. Next slide, please. In this graph, we displayed how important and positive people think the outcomes of implementing industrial CCS in the UK and the Netherlands are. These opinions were measured on a scale of 1 to 7. The graph has been zoomed in to show differences between outcomes more clearly. All outcomes shown in the top right are seen as important and positive. The most positive and important outcome is the contribution of CCS to climate change mitigation. Other important and positive outcomes are related to the economics, the impact on employment, on companies and industry, on subsidies by the government, and on other options for decarbonizing industry. All outcomes in the top left are seen as slightly negative and important. These outcomes are about the safety of onshore and offshore transport via pipelines and the safety of offshore CO2 storage. One outcome is seen as neutral and least important, the need for construction work on new pipelines. Next slide, please. Now I would like to ask a question to you. Are citizens that live close to industry more or less positive about industrial CCS? So are they more positive, less positive, or does proximity to industrial facilities have little effect? So please let me know what you think. So as you can all see from the results, most of you think that citizens that live close to industrial facilities are more positive about industrial CCS. This could be because they are also included in the positive outcomes that such a development might create. So it might create employment and other positive consequences for the environment. It also might be less positive because it might create some negative consequences for the environment that people live in, like construction work or safety risks. Next slide, please. So to give some more information about how this result actually worked, I will explain this further. So we measured proximity in 2 ways in our study, by asking respondents how close they perceive to be living to industry, and by including 2 groups of respondents that actually live close to industry. Our results showed that both types of proximity have little effect on people's opinions, but that the attitude that people have toward industry does have a very strong effect. Therefore, it's not people's proximity to industry, but their thoughts and associations with industry that matter. A caveat is that we need to explore this relationship in more depth using additional questions included in our survey. For example, about the attachment and associations people have with the place where they live. Next slide, please. Based on these highlights, we have 3 implications for practice. First, the public is more aware and more positive about CCS than before. In previous studies, citizens indicated lower awareness of CCS and more negative opinions. This may be caused by differences in a technological configuration, such as capture at industrial plants and offshore storage, changes over time, or differences in measurement. However, the differences are small and based on averages. Some people remain concerned about industrial CCS even after reading balanced and nuanced information. These people are primarily concerned about safety. Hence, public engagement with safety procedures is important to alleviate people's concerns. For example, by designing monitoring technologies and procedures together with citizens. Finally, the attitude of citizens toward industry strongly influences their opinion. Furthermore, many people have weak or negative associations with industry. Therefore, managing the relationship between citizens and industries carefully is vital. For example, by including citizens in envisioning the transition strategies of industry. Next slide, please. All these results and more will appear in a report that will be published this spring. We are also producing a short film about the results and an academic paper. Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Diana Cismaru, who will talk about stakeholder perceptions of CCUS.
Thank you, Kevin. I want to thank you all for attending this webinar in challenging circumstances. I'm Dr. Diana Maria Cismaru, and I'm the head of Public Relations Department in SNSPA Bucharest. Together with my team, I work in Work Package 6. Today, I will speak about stakeholder perceptions of CCUS in Romania. This activity was performed in Germany and Romania with a similar methodology. But today, because the time is limited, I will speak only about the results from Romania. Next slide, please. Our objectives of research were the identification of the main issues in the CCUS development, as reflected in the perspectives of various categories of stakeholders. Also, we wanted to identify the differences of perceptions across the categories of stakeholders. And finally, to explore the experience of stakeholders for the identification of factors that influence the public acceptance. Next slide, please. We choose the interview as a method, and the interview protocol included several sections, mainly the introduction, the definition of CCUS and a brief perception of the present state of development, previous experience of respondents in CCUS projects, an interactive task that consisted in ordering cards for evaluating the importance of CCUS actors, benefits, costs, and risks, and finally, the evaluation of the level of awareness and acceptance of general and local publics from the perspective of stakeholders. Next slide, please. The data collection was performed between July and October 2019. A target in the selection of our sample was to include the two relevant areas from Romania, which are the Oltenia area with the energy complex Oltenia as the main energy actor, and also the Liberty Steel complex from Galați, a large CO2 emitter. And finally, we performed interviews from the following categories. 5 representatives from the industry sector, 2 representatives from companies in the energy field, 4 researchers, 2 public officers, 4 representatives of the civil society, including NGOs. Next slide, please. A summary of the results shows that the perspectives were diversified, ranging from optimistic, relying on the inevitable technology development, to pessimistic, emphasizing the huge costs and the lack of decision. Also, we found that the companies are really interested in developing CCUS project, but they are on a standby position because the implementation of CCUS cannot be covered by their own resources. In regard with participation and involvement, we found that the coal-powered energy producers are more interested in comparison with the industrial companies. And finally, the respondents perceived the large public and the local publics as having little knowledge on CCUS, but the public acceptance at general and local level could be obtained with proactive public information campaigns. Next slide, please. For performing the content analysis, we used the Atlas program, version 8. We made an open coding, relying on the grounded theory, and we unified the codes. And in several code groups, mainly acceptance, benefits, challenges, costs, facilitators, knowledge gaps, risks, traffic light, and use preference. Next slide, please. From these groups, challenges, facilitators, and risks were more frequently addressed in the interviews. Next slide, please. Among the challenges in CCUS implementation, stakeholders perceived the most important challenges as being the decision-making, the financing, and the lack of political continuity in Romania. Also, some respondents thought that technological advances are needed for a proper implementation of CCUS projects. Next slide, please. The main risk that was discussed in the interviews was the pipeline leakage, but also several respondents pointed out that the pipeline leakage is unlikely to happen. The leakage from storage site was less discussed or considered as possible. Other risks seen as important in Romania were the insufficient funds or the longer time needed for implementation. Next slide, please. Speaking about the acceptance, many respondents mentioned that they would support CCUS projects, even if these projects would meet important barriers. Also, many respondents mentioned that there is a lack of media visibility of CCUS topics in Romania, and also there is a lack of awareness for the general public and for the local publics. But many respondents believe that the local communities would support these types of projects if proper connections would be made between the implementation of CCUS projects and the interests, the benefits for the local community. Next slide, please. Among the facilitators perceived by stakeholders for developing CCUS projects, the need for developing and launching public information campaigns appeared as the most cited facilitator in the interviews, no less than 27 mentions. Some respondents insisted not only on the strategy needed in these public information campaigns, but also on the educating role of the information campaigns. And I selected two relevant citations here. First, from a researcher in the energy field, I would lay an emphasis on information, educating the young generations, start from schools, high schools. And from another researcher in geology, the part of educating the actors involved is very important. Thank you. Next slide. A full report on this activity, including the results from Germany, will be published soon on the website of the ALIGN project, ALIGN-CCUS.eu. And if more information is needed on this task or on our results, I can receive emails or questions on my email address. Thank you very much. The next presentation is from Dr. Christine Boomsma from Leiden University.
Thank you for the introduction, Diana. I'm Christina Boomsma, and I'm a senior researcher in the Social, Economic and Organizational Department at Leiden University. And today I will talk about our research on community engagement and community strategies within the context of CO2. Slide, please. Is community engagement needed for CCS projects? Earlier projects have been cancelled in part due to a lack of public support. Current plans in many countries are for offshore storage, where there's no obvious local community directly near the storage site, and the CO2 injection wells are often far enough from land that they are largely out of public view. But we know from research on other offshore technologies that out of sight does not necessarily mean out of mind. Also, parts of CCUS technology, such as transport, will still be onshore. So, how to create positive relationships with local communities remains an important question when it comes to the siting of CCUS development. And one approach which can be used here, which is the focus of many of our studies, is offering community compensation. So what is community compensation? Community compensation can be defined as a form of equity adjustment aimed at correcting imbalances associated with the siting of new or expanded facilities. So while there are different underlying reasons for opposition, a common perception is that the costs and benefits are not distributed in a fair way. The cost of projects are usually felt locally or regionally, while benefits lie at a national level. And previous studies have shown that projects may lead to less public resistance if there's a balance between local benefits and perceived negative impacts. To achieve this, community compensation can be offered to local residents. This compensation can have many different forms, for example, monetary incentives, but also public goods or employment opportunities. Next slide, please. Research on community engagement and compensation in the CCUS context is still limited, so we need to learn from other relevant projects and technologies to make sure that important insights are used. And within ALIGN, we have used 3 lines of research to look at community engagement and compensation strategies: a literature review to identify key debates, interviews to identify best practices and knowledge gaps, and quantitative research to test the effectiveness of different compensation strategies. In today's talk, I will focus on the interviews. Next slide, please. Last year, we conducted interviews with community engagement managers in the UK, the Netherlands, and Romania. Community engagement managers in general tend to be responsible for communicating about the project with important stakeholders, including local communities, and for developing and executing an engagement strategy. We spoke to community engagement managers working on current or former CCUS projects, as well as managers working on other energy and infrastructure projects, as the number of CCUS projects in the countries we examined is still limited, and because we wanted to examine what can be learned from these other projects as well. In the interviews, we addressed their experiences with community engagement, such as important success factors and pitfalls. And next, we did a card sorting task to examine experiences with community compensation specifically. Interviews were presented with cards containing different types of community compensation, as well as different goals or aims of community compensation. And this card sorting task helped us to look at which community strategies interviews were familiar with, their perceived effectiveness, and what they could achieve. And finally, throughout the interviews, 3 returning topics were addressed, which looked at the influence of legal regulations and government guidelines, the difference between onshore and offshore projects, and knowledge gaps that the interviewees experience. I will only discuss a brief subset of our results today, and further results will be available in a report that will be published later this spring. Next slide, please. So we asked the community engagement managers for important pitfalls and success factors regarding community engagement, and these are the main pitfalls that came forward. I will highlight one of these. Dealing with other stakeholders was commonly mentioned, and often this related to collaborating with people in government, for example, who might be involved in driving the project. And things went wrong if there weren't clear agreements on who's responsible for engaging with the community, what is communicated about the project, and when. And one of the main challenges here is making sure that people don't receive conflicting information, as this often fueled negative reactions and opposition to the project. And importantly, community engagement managers don't just deal with external stakeholders, but also internal stakeholders. So often the need for community engagement isn't clear to everyone in their organization, and community engagement managers are involved too late or not at all, or not given the support that they need. The effect that the community could have on the project is underestimated. Next slide, please. So in terms of success factors, again, a number could be identified, and I'd like to highlight one of these as it relates to the topic of community compensation, the importance to listen to local needs. This also means looking at existing issues there are in the community and whether there is a way that these could be resolved as part of the project. Is there something that could be done to make the community better? Next slide, please. Now I would like to ask you all, when you think community engagement is a success, is this when there's no opposition to the project, when people on both sides keep talking to each other, or when the project is finished within the proposed deadline? So I can see that most people think that this is when people on both sides keep talking to each other. Now, next slide, please. When we asked our interviewees this question as well, there were two perspectives that came forward. And some mentioned both perspectives, but often someone would mention either one or the other. And the first perspective is one that assumes that including the community in the project leads to a better end result. So community engagement is successful when the project is not just from the developers, but from the developers and the community together. As for the second perspective, this is similar to what most of you answered on the question. So community engagement is successful when you are still talking to each other, whether people are in favor or against the project. And the community feels that things are being done as promised and it is less inconvenient than they expected. Next slide, please. Finally, some early results from the analysis on community compensation. So we found that community engagement managers might be familiar with compensation measures, but they do not necessarily use the term. The use of the term compensation is often avoided, as it seems to imply that you've done something wrong. Another one of the discussion points in the interviews was the role of legal guidelines and government regulations. Interviews were uncertain whether compensation would be more effective as a mandatory or voluntary measure. While mandatory compensation may help prevent compensation to be seen as a bribe, it also felt that mandatory and voluntary compensation may serve very different goals. As for the third point on the slide, when linking different types of compensation and goals, a distinction was often made between measures that serve short-term goals and measures that have longer-term goals. Next slide, please. Now, as I mentioned before, we interviewed community engagement managers from different sectors, both CCUS and other sectors. And some points came up during these conversations that show the challenges when it comes to community engagement and compensation in the CCUS context specifically. What we found was that community engagement managers felt because CCUS can have both onshore and offshore elements, we still know very little about how the public responds to offshore storage. As stated by one of the interviewees, you're not directly dealing with residents, so it all sometimes seems a bit more elusive. When it comes to public perceptions in the Netherlands, community engagement managers noticed a clear influence of previous and other projects, such as a CCUS project that was cancelled, which received a lot of media attention in Barendrecht, and problems with earthquakes due to gas extraction in the north of the country. As one interview notes, there's a lot more to explain and a lot more things to overcome than before. And finally, many noted the lack of experience when it comes to implementing CCUS, at least in the countries that we examined, and the many unknowns that there still are when it comes to the need for community engagement in this context. Next slide, please. So we held a workshop last year with community engagement managers to discuss the results of the interviews. And I wanted to end with some of the quotes from this workshop as they summarize some of the important points coming out of this research so far. First of all, the need for the public to see CCUS as part of a wider energy transition and a climate change mitigation strategy. CCS cannot be seen in isolation. Second, there's a need for different measures and a flexible approach when it comes to community engagement. As a community engagement manager, you need a large toolbox using different approaches at different phases of a project. And finally, what can we as researchers and academics offer? We can help by highlighting the need for community engagement and providing an evidence base for the work of community engagement managers. Next slide, please. Thank you very much for listening. If you're interested in finding out more, about this work. A report will come out later this spring, and a paper is currently under review in the International Journal of Greenhouse Gas Control.
Thank you very much, Christine. We're now going to begin answering the questions submitted during today's webinar. And just as a reminder, you can still submit questions through the questions pane in your control panel. So we already received some questions. I have a first question for Christine. So you mentioned community compensation measures. Could you give an example of a community compensation measure that was seen as effective?
Well, in our interviews, there were lots of different community compensation measures that were being mentioned. And basically, whether they were effective or not depended a lot on the situation itself. So it depended on what the needs of the community was, what the local context was. So a certain measure might be very effective in one setting, but it might not be very effective in another setting. So it highlighted the importance of finding out the needs of the local community first before deciding on a compensation measure.
Thank you. So I have a question for Diana. So you mentioned that funding is an issue in Romania, perceived to be an issue by the stakeholders. Could you elaborate a bit more on what are the challenges to CCUS development in Romania?
Thank you for the question. Yes, outside of funding, there are also other challenges for developing CCUS projects in Romania, as for example, the need for interdisciplinary teams, or the lack of the possible response of the possible negative opinion of publics, and also the lack of human resources, because there is a need of highly specialized human resources for implementing this type of projects. These were the main challenges, and also it was discussed the role of NGOs, because they sometimes might have good intentions, but in some situations they might be the trigger for the formation of a negative public opinion.
Thank you very much. I have a question for Kevin. And the question is as follows. So what's the position of NGOs about CCUS and specifically storage onshore?
Well, thank you for the question, Emma. So it's not something we specifically looked into in this part of the research, and I think there's a wide difference in how NGOs look at this topic. So for the countries that we looked at, so for the Netherlands and the UK, onshore CO2 storage is not within the realm of possibility in the next year. So at least the Dutch government, for example, they've excluded this possibility. So storage of CO2 will only be offshore in any projects that will come up soon. Well, for NGOs, you can see a bit of a difference. So we have an NGO included in our project that thinks about CCUS and the position that this technology can take very constructively. There's also NGOs that are a little bit more critical or only see very specific applications for CCUS. So I would say that there's a range among NGOs of what they think about this technology and how it can be applied. But all of the applications that we looked into in the part of the study that I presented are offshore. It's only offshore CO2 storage.
Thank you, Kevin. So another question for Christine. So you mentioned on your slides that context and history could be negative. Could you elaborate a bit more on this?
Yes, of course. So, for example, in the Netherlands, there have been previous CCUS projects that were cancelled due to one of the reasons why these were cancelled was opposition by the local publics. And there were quite a lot of issues with these projects as well about the communication with the local communities and how these what eventually led to the problems, the projects being cancelled. And a lot of people, at least local communities, still remember these projects. Obviously, it wasn't that long ago. They remember what happened. So now with new CCS plans, these previous communications and the previous projects that have happened might influence how people look at CCUS now, how they would perceive potential local projects near their homes. But it could also have a positive impact if people have a previous good experience with, for example, a specific industry near their home, which is now developing these plans. It can also have a positive impact, this local history. So it can go both ways.
Thank you, Christine. I have another question for Diana. So today you presented the results from Romania, and you also mentioned that similar work has been conducted in Germany. Could you share something about, for example, whether the results for Germany were very different from Romania or quite similar?
Oh yes, there are many differences between the findings in Germany and Romania, as they are in different phases, let's say, of CCUS development, and very different, we could say, quite opposite in some respects. For example, the fact that in Romania we found that there is little knowledge on CCUS, but the local and general public would not be necessarily negative about CCUS. There are many reasons to believe that they could accept the CCUS projects if they are presented in a correct manner. But in Germany, there are several points. I mean, a big part of a large category of or many respondents indicated that many segments of publics are opposite for the implementation of CCUS projects. Another respect in which the results are very different is the issue of the use of carbon. From the findings from Germany resulted that people are very interested in the use of CO2 captured, and this is the only way in which they could perceive these projects as positive, mainly CCU against CCS. In Romania, this is an issue that regards more the specialized part, let's say. Mainly, the respondents indicated several ways of using the CO2 captured, but this was not indicated as being very important. They emphasized that only a small quantity of the CO2 captured could be used. So this is not an issue in the moment.
Thank you, Diana. I have a question I'd like to ask Kevin. So have you compared your results with Eurobarometer survey on CCS published in 2011? And if so, is there any positive or negative change with regard to public awareness comparing to that survey since then?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Emma. Yes, we have compared our results to both the Eurobarometer survey as well as other informed polls that were done, for example, in the Netherlands. And what you see there is that the Netherlands used to be a bit of an exception, especially in the Eurobarometer results with regard to awareness. And we also see that in our results. So awareness in the Netherlands is relatively high compared to other countries in Europe. But you see that compared to the Eurobarometer results in the UK, awareness there is much higher than it was before. And you also see if you compare our results to previous informed polls that were done, that opinions tend to be slightly more positive. And there's a couple of explanations you can give for this. So one is that these previous studies usually examine CCS in a bit of a different way, usually much more in general, or with an emphasis on power, on the power sector. So for coal-fired power plants, for example, also sometimes it's onshore storage. So the technology we actually explain is different. The time is very different. So many of these studies were done 6 to 10 years ago. So things in between might have changed. For example, the recent climate accord in the Netherlands has received a lot of attention, also with regards to its industrial emission reductions and the role of CCS there. So things have changed there. And there are slight differences between all of the studies. So none of the studies are exactly the same, which makes it difficult to make conclusions where some variation might not just be because of differences in the method. So that's I guess the primary differences there.
Thank you, Kevin. So we have time for one final question. I'd like to ask Christine the following question. So you mentioned you distinguish mandatory versus voluntary compensation. So, but what would be reasons for making community compensation mandatory? And a brief answer, please.
Well, one of the main reasons is because community compensation is sometimes perceived as a bribe, so seen as a way sort of give local communities something. So in exchange for that, they might be more accepting of community compensation of the project. So by making community compensation mandatory, you might overcome these feelings because it's mandatory, everyone has to offer it, so it happens in all projects. So that way it isn't viewed as a bribe. So that's one of the reasons to make it mandatory.
Thank you very much to all the presenters for answering the questions and for everyone for submitting their questions. The webinar team will respond to any unanswered questions after the event by email. So if you post a question and we received many, but haven't received your answer yet, you will receive your answer after the webinar. And with this, we've come to the end of our webinar. I would like to thank everyone for attending today's webinar, and of course also the presenters and organizers for making this possible. Once you leave today's session, you will receive a survey on the webinar, and we would appreciate it if you could complete that and provide your feedback. You will also receive a follow-up email within 2 days with a link to the recording of today's webinar. On behalf of all presenters, thank you very much for joining us today and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.